January 24th, 1945. Just after 7 in the morning. The sun had not yet burned through the low winter haze hanging over eastern France, and the ground was frozen solid, locked under weeks of sub-zero temperatures. Snow clung to broken branches and shallow foxholes, turning the forest into a pale, motionless landscape that felt quiet in the way only battlefields ever are quiet because something violent is about to happen. Inside a small, half-buried command post near the front line, the day had already gone wrong. German artillery had started falling minutes earlier. Not random fire, not harassment. This was deliberate, measured, and methodical. Shells walked through the tree line in controlled intervals, tearing bark from trunks, snapping limbs, sending frozen earth into the air. Each impact landed closer than the last. Whoever was adjusting the fire knew exactly where the American positions were. This was not an accident. This was preparation. 3rd Battalion of the 7th Infantry Regiment had been holding this stretch of the line for over 2 weeks. 18 days of cold, exhaustion, and constant pressure. No relief, no rotation, no warmth. Men slept when they could, hunched in frozen foxholes, boots never fully drying, fingers numb even inside gloves. Every night, German patrols probed the line, testing for weakness. Every morning brought new casualties: artillery, snipers, frostbite, fatigue. By this morning, the battalion was already worn thin. Maps on the command post table showed what everyone there already knew. This sector sat near the edge of the Colmar Pocket, the last significant German-held territory west of the Rhine. For weeks, Allied forces had tried to crush it. Every attempt had stalled. The Germans hadn't retreated because they couldn't. They were boxed in, and boxed-in armies fight differently. Desperately, aggressively, with nothing left to lose. Operation Nordwind had begun weeks earlier, Hitler's final gamble in the West. While the world's attention focused north on the Battle of the Bulge, German forces here had been ordered to break through American lines, split the front, and buy time. The larger offensive had failed. But here, in this frozen pocket of forest and farmland, the danger was very real and very immediate. At approximately 0700, the artillery intensified. The shells didn't just fall, they crept. One burst near the forward foxholes, another closer to the tree line behind them, another closer still. Trees exploded into splinters. Frozen soil geysered upward and rained back down like shrapnel. The air shook with each impact, pressure waves slamming into the earth, rattling teeth, compressing lungs. This was the kind of fire meant to blind and pin, not destroy. A preparatory barrage. Every experienced officer in the command post recognized it instantly. An attack was coming. The question was not if. The question was how much time they had. 12 minutes after it began, the barrage stopped. That silence was worse than the explosions. In war, silence after artillery doesn't mean safety. It means movement. It means engines starting. It means infantry stepping off. It means that whatever protection the shells were meant to provide is about to be used. Seconds later, the first reports came in. German infantry advancing through the woods. Hundreds of them. Moving in formation. Disciplined. Coordinated. Then the tanks. 6 heavy Tiger tanks pushing forward behind the infantry. Their engines rumbling low and steady. Metal tracks chewing through frozen ground. 60 tons each. Thick frontal armor. Guns capable of tearing apart foxholes at point-blank range. There were no American tanks positioned to stop them. No tank destroyers. No heavy anti-armor weapons ready. If the Tigers reached the line, the battalion would be overrun. Everyone in the command post understood what that meant. Foxholes crushed. Defensive positions erased. Survivors running. Panic spreading. A collapse that wouldn't stop at one battalion. The Germans wouldn't just punch through, they would roll forward, exploiting the gap, widening it, killing or capturing anyone in their path. Minutes mattered now, not hours. Not even tens of minutes. Artillery was the only thing that could stop the attack, but artillery is blind without eyes. The battalion's forward observation post, the men responsible for spotting targets and adjusting fire, had been hit during the initial barrage. Dead or wounded. No one was in position to see the enemy's advance clearly. From the command post, the view was blocked by forest and terrain. Maps showed likely avenues of approach, but maps don't move. Tanks do. Calling artillery fire without observation was gambling, and gambling against Tiger tanks was suicide. The officers gathered around the table understood the problem immediately. They could request fire, but without precise corrections, the shells would fall too far back, too far forward, or worse on their own men. And even if they guessed right once, the Germans would keep moving. Adjustments had to be constant, real-time, precise. Someone needed to see the enemy. That meant someone had to go forward, not to the front line, but beyond it. Across 400 yards of open, frozen ground, already registered by German guns. Ground that German observers were watching. Ground that would be under renewed artillery fire the moment the infantry closed the distance. And whoever went forward would not be leading an attack. They would be lying exposed, alone, with nothing but a telephone line connecting them to the guns miles behind the line. The clock was running. Every minute that passed brought the German infantry closer. Every minute gave the Tigers time to break through the trees and into the open. Every minute increased the chance that the battalion's last line of defense would fail. No one spoke at first. This was not hesitation. It was calculation. Every officer there understood what was being asked and what it would likely cost. Sending a man forward wasn't a bold maneuver. It was a last resort, a measure taken when all safer options were gone. The artillery could stop the attack, but only if someone was willing to become its eyes. Outside, the silence was already breaking. Engines grew louder. The sound of movement carried through the forest. Snow crunched under boots. The German advance was no longer theoretical. The battalion commander looked back down at the map. There were no more choices left to weigh, only consequences. And somewhere between the frozen ground outside and the marked grid lines on that table, a decision was about to be made, one that would turn the next few hours into a countdown measured not in minutes, but in survival. The man who would step forward was not the one anyone expected. He wasn't the company commander. He wasn't leading a platoon dug in along the tree line. He wasn't even assigned to a combat role that morning. His job, at least on paper, kept him behind the front inside the command post, surrounded by maps, reports, and radio traffic. First Lieutenant Garlin Murl Conner was the battalion's intelligence officer. Intelligence officers didn't charge forward. They didn't lead assaults. They didn't crawl into exposed positions under artillery fire. Their role was analytical, not tactical. They gathered information, interrogated prisoners, studied patrol reports, and tried to predict what the enemy would do next. They worked in pencil marks and grid coordinates, not foxholes and fields of fire. Conner was 25 years old. He stood barely 5'6" and weighed around 120 pounds. He was not physically imposing. He didn't look like the kind of officer men instinctively followed into chaos. He came from a tobacco farm in rural Kentucky, a place so isolated the nearest high school was 15 miles away. He never finished his education there. War had pulled him into uniform long before life gave him anything else. He had enlisted in March of 1941, before Pearl Harbor, before the country fully understood what was coming. 4 years later, war had carved lines into him that no rank insignia could show. He had been wounded 7 times. The most recent wound had sent him to a hospital just weeks earlier. He was still healing when he returned to the battalion 2 days before this morning. His shoulder hadn't fully recovered. His body hadn't either. The cold didn't help. Nothing did. And yet, he was there. standing inside a frozen command post while German artillery prepared to erase the front line. No one looked at him expecting a solution that mattered, because what separates Conner from the other men in that room was not bravado or desperation. It was familiarity. He had seen moments like this before, not this exact battlefield, not this exact attack, but this same collapse of options. This same narrowing tunnel where doctrine stopped applying and instinct took over. He had been through 10 major campaigns, 4 amphibious landings, Italy, Anzio, southern France. Each one taught the same lesson in different ways. When the plan fails, someone has to move. Conner didn't speak right away. He studied the map like everyone else, watched fingers trace likely avenues of approach, listened to reports coming in from 4 positions. German infantry closing, tanks advancing behind them, distance shrinking, 400 yards, 300, 250. Every update shaved seconds off the timeline. The artillery was ready. The guns sat miles behind the line, crews waiting on coordinates, fingers near triggers. But artillery without observation is noise. It frightens. It disrupts. It rarely stops anything determined. Conner understood that better than most. He also understood what it meant to step forward. The ground between the command post and the front line was open. No cover, snow-covered and frozen. The surface hard enough to reflect concussive blasts farther and faster. German observers had already registered it. Any movement there would be seen. Any movement would draw fire. Beyond the front line was worse. Ahead of the foxholes lay a shallow depression in the ground. Barely a ditch. It wasn't protection. It was geometry. A slight dip in the terrain just deep enough to keep a man's silhouette below the horizon while allowing him to see forward. It was the only place where an observer could survive long enough to do the job. Survive long enough. That was the phrase no one said out loud. Conner knew the odds. He knew that once the German artillery resumed, and it would, he would be the focal point. He would be the reference mark both sides would adjust toward. German guns trying to kill him. American guns landing close enough to save the line and possibly end him in the process. This was not a role he was assigned. This was not an order he was given. This was a decision. The officers around the table were still weighing alternatives when Conner reached for the telephone. It was a simple field phone. Black casing. Crank handle on the side. A spool of wire beside it coiled tightly, waiting to be unrolled. The wire was thin, fragile, easily cut by shrapnel or boots or tracks. If it broke, the artillery would go silent. Conner picked up the handset. No speech. No announcement. He didn't volunteer loudly. He didn't ask permission. He didn't frame what he was about to do as bravery. He looked at the battalion commander. That was enough. The commander understood immediately what Conner intended and what it meant. There was no time to argue. No time to stop him. By the time words would have formed, Conner was already moving. He stepped out of the command post into the cold. The artillery fire had paused, but the silence was thin, deceptive. A breath before violence resumed. Conner didn't waste it. He ran. 400 yards doesn't sound like much on a map. It feels endless under fire. The wire unspooled behind him as he moved, a thin line stretching back toward the command post, the only thing connecting him to the guns that could still save the battalion. His boots punched through the snow crust with every step, breaking rhythm, stealing speed. Cold air burned his lungs. The ground was uneven. Frozen ruts and debris threatened to trip him. At 100 yards, the German guns opened up again. The first shells landed wide. 40 yards off, then 30. The observers were adjusting. They could see him now, a lone figure moving fast across open ground. No mistaking what he was doing. Conner didn't slow. A shell exploded ahead of him, shattering a tree into splinters that sprayed across the snow. Another burst behind him, the concussion wave slamming into his back, lifting him slightly off his feet. He stumbled, but stayed upright, kept running. At 200 yards, a shell landed close enough to shower him with frozen dirt and fragments of bark. His ears rang. The world narrowed to breath and motion, and the wire pulling taut behind him. He vaulted over a fallen trunk without stopping. Shrapnel hissed as it cooled in the snow around him. The smell of cordite hung in the air. At 300 yards, he reached the American front line. Men in foxholes looked up in disbelief as he passed. An intelligence officer. A telephone. Running toward the enemy. He didn't stop to explain. He kept going. 30 yards beyond the foxholes, Conner dropped into the shallow ditch. It barely covered him when he lay flat. Not enough to stop bullets. Not enough to stop artillery. Just enough to see. The wire held. He cranked the handset. The line buzzed, then cleared. The Artillery Fire Direction Center answered. At that moment, Conner stopped being an intelligence officer. He became the battalion's eyes. And every second from here forward would depend on how long he could stay alive. From the shallow ditch, the battlefield finally came into focus. Conner raised his head just enough to see over the frozen lip of earth. The German infantry were closer than expected. Less than 200 yards out, moving through the trees in disciplined formations, rifles up, advancing in short rushes. One squad moved while another covered. Professionals, veterans, men who had done this before and expected to do it again. Behind them came the tanks. The Tigers pushed forward slowly, deliberately, their weight crushing saplings and snapping branches as if the forest itself offered no resistance. Even at a distance, they looked massive angular silhouettes sliding between the trunks, guns steady, engines rumbling with a sound that felt less like noise and more like pressure. Conner counted them. 4 at first, then all 6. If they broke into the open, there would be no stopping them. He brought the handset closer to his mouth and gave the coordinates. Calm, precise, no emotion in his voice. Just numbers and adjustments. The fire direction officer repeated them back, confirming. The first shells would arrive in under a minute. Those seconds stretched. Conner watched the German infantry continue their advance, unaware that they were already marked. Unaware that 12 American guns miles behind the line had just pivoted toward them. He counted again. 38. 39. The sky screamed. The first salvo slammed into the forest behind the German formation. Too far back. Trees exploded. Dirt and ice sprayed into the air, but the infantry didn't stop. They didn't even flinch. Artillery landing behind an advance was common. It meant the defenders were guessing. Conner was not guessing. He adjusted the fire. Shorter, closer. Drop 100. The next salvo landed among them. The effect was immediate and violent. The forest erupted. Shrapnel tore through branches and bodies alike. Men vanished where they stood. Others collapsed, screaming, clutching wounds that no medic could reach. The advance stalled, formations breaking apart under the sudden shock. Conner didn't pause. Repeat fire. Send coordinates. Again the gun spoke. Again the ground came apart. The artillery was firing for effect now. Shells landing in tight concentration, hammering the same patch of forest again and again. The German infantry scattered, discipline dissolving under the pressure. But the tanks kept coming. Conner shifted his focus. The Tigers had broken free of the trees, moving into open ground. He could see them clearly now. 60 tons of armor advancing in a wedge, commanders exposed in their turrets, scanning for targets. One of them fired. The 88mm gun cracked, the sound sharp and final. A foxhole to Conner's right ceased to exist. Snow and dirt exploded upward. The men inside never moved again. Another shot. Another position erased. The Tigers were 200 yards out. Conner adjusted the fire onto the tanks. Artillery was not designed for this. It could kill infantry, flatten buildings, shatter morale. Tanks were different. Small targets, armored targets. The shells began falling around them. 10 yards short, 15 yards wide. The Tigers drove through the blasts, their crews unfazed. Conner tightened the pattern. Drop 50. This time, a shell struck a track. Metal snapped. One Tiger slewed sideways and stopped, immobilized but still lethal. Another took a hit to the engine deck, smoke pouring from the rear. But 4 more kept advancing, and now they were turning toward him. The tank commanders had seen the wire, had seen the muzzle flashes from the artillery adjustments. They knew someone forward was directing the fire, and they were coming to kill him. Conner pressed himself deeper into the ditch. 18 inches of frozen earth. That was all that separated him from machine gun fire, from high explosive shells, from death. He could see the faces of the tank commanders now. Young men, focused, determined. They were less than 150 yards away. Conner lifted the handset again. He understood the geometry, understood the margins, understood that if the shells landed too far forward, the tanks would continue. Too far back, and they would hit his own line. Too close, and they would hit him. This was the point where training stopped helping. He spoke anyway. Fire on my position. The words traveled down the wire, carried calmly, evenly, as if he were requesting another adjustment. On the other end, the fire direction officer froze. Repeated the coordinates. Asked for confirmation. Conner confirmed. The officer asked again. Calling artillery onto your own position was not standard procedure. It was a last act. An admission that there was no safe distance left. That survival no longer mattered as much as stopping what was coming. Conner confirmed a third time. The first shells landed 30 yards in front of the ditch. The concussion was immediate and overwhelming. The blast waves slammed into him, flattening his chest, forcing the air from his lungs. Dirt and shrapnel screamed overhead. The sound was not noise anymore. It was pressure, like the world itself collapsing inward. Conner stayed in place, dropped 20. The next salvo landed closer. Close enough that he could feel heat on his face. Close enough that fragments struck the edge of the ditch and buried themselves in the frozen earth inches from his hands. If he stood, he would be shredded. If the shells landed 10 yards closer, there would be nothing left to protect him. The Tigers stopped. The commanders dropped into their turrets, hatches slamming shut. Even inside 60 tons of armor, they didn't want to be exposed to shells detonating at point-blank range. The advance stalled, engines idling, tracks grinding against the frozen ground. But the infantry wasn't finished. Conner could see them regrouping behind the tanks, using the armored hulls as cover. Company strength. Survivors who had crawled through the barrage. Men who had learned how to move under artillery fire. They were forming again, preparing to push forward behind the steel. Conner adjusted the fire back and forth, walking the shells across their approach routes. Every time they moved, the artillery followed. Every attempt to advance dissolved under explosions. German artillery joined in. Shells began landing around the ditch. 15 yards left, 15 yards right. The Germans were bracketing him now, adjusting methodically, trying to pinpoint the observer who was killing their attack. American shells, German shells, both falling in the same 100-yard circle. Conner didn't move. A fragment struck his shoulder. He felt the impact but not the pain. His arm went numb. He switched the handset to his other hand and kept calling adjustments. The tanks began advancing again. Conner split the fire between them. One shell struck a turret ring, jamming it. Another destroyed a second track. A Tiger crew bailed out under fire. 2 of them cut down before they reached cover. Only one tank remained operational. It pushed forward through smoke and debris. Gun firing. Machine guns raking the American line. It was less than 50 yards out now. Close enough to destroy the foxholes one by one. Conner made the final adjustment. Maximum concentration. high explosive, every gun. The shells arrived together. When the smoke cleared, the Tiger was still there, but it was blind and immobile. The crew abandoned it, running for the trees. Rifle fire cut most of them down. The advance collapsed. The German infantry pulled back, not retreating, breaking contact. The survivors moved away from the kill zone, dragging wounded men, leaving the dead where they fell. Conner stayed in the ditch, listening, watching, making sure. The order had worked, but it had changed everything. The battlefield did not erupt in celebration. When the guns finally fell silent, the quiet felt unnatural, as if the world itself was unsure whether it was allowed to breathe again. Smoke drifted through shattered trees. Snow fell slowly into overlapping shell craters, covering fragments of metal, splintered wood, and the shapes of men who would not move again. Conner stayed in the ditch. For several minutes after the last artillery round landed, he didn't lift his head. He listened. The rumble of engines was gone. No boots crunching forward. No shouted orders. Only wind moving through broken branches and distant voices calling for medics. The telephone handset was silent. The artillery battery was out of ammunition. Only then did Conner begin to move. He pushed himself up slowly, his legs stiff, unresponsive after hours, pressed into frozen earth. Pain arrived late, blooming in his shoulder, where shrapnel had embedded itself. His hands shook not from fear now, but from cold and exhaustion. He took one step, then another, testing whether his body would still obey him. Behind him, the ditch he had used for cover was barely visible anymore, its edges crumbling inward under the weight of repeated blasts. It was not a heroic position. It would not be marked on any map. It was just a shallow depression in the ground where a decision had been made. American soldiers emerged from their foxholes cautiously, as if unsure the danger was truly over. They stared at the ground between the line and the tree line beyond. The forest looked torn apart. Craters overlapped craters. Pieces of armored steel lay scattered across the snow. Bodies were everywhere. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. The battalion commander met Conner at the front line. He looked at the battlefield, then at Conner. No words passed between them. There was nothing to say that would add meaning to what had already happened. Medics reached the wounded intelligence private who had crawled forward to support Conner. The cold had slowed the bleeding. He would survive. He would be back in the battalion weeks later. Another quiet life, saved by a decision he would never forget. Conner returned to the command post. A medic examined his shoulder and removed the shrapnel. A small piece of metal lodged just beneath the skin. The medic told him he was lucky. Conner nodded. He did not argue. Luck had nothing to do with it anymore. Later, the intelligence teams went forward to assess the damage. They counted bodies, logged destroyed equipment, marked disabled tanks for recovery. The numbers were recorded cleanly, professionally. At least 150 German casualties. All 6 Tiger tanks destroyed or abandoned. The counterattack broken. 3rd Battalion had held. After that morning, the Germans did not try again. The battalion remained on the line for days, then weeks. The front moved forward. The war continued. New battles replaced old ones. The moment in the ditch became just another line in an after-action report, another entry in a ledger of violence that stretched across continents. Conner was recommended for the Medal of Honor. The paperwork moved slowly, too slowly. By the time it reached the highest levels, Conner was already being rotated home. He had been in combat for over 2 years. Wounded 7 times, the army decided he had given enough. He left France in March of 1945. The war in Europe ended weeks later. Conner went home to Kentucky. He did not tell the story. When people asked, he said he had done what needed to be done. Nothing more. He never described the ditch, never described the tanks, never described the order. The medals went into a cardboard box, then into a duffel bag, then into a closet. Life went on. He married, farmed, served his community, helped other veterans file claims, navigate bureaucracy, rebuild their lives. He spoke about soil conservation and crop rotation and weather patterns. He did not speak about January 24th, 1945. Years turned into decades. The men he had saved grew old. Some never knew how close they had come to dying. Some suspected. Few truly understood. Conner aged quietly. Diabetes. Kidney failure. The body that had endured so much finally began to fail. It wasn't until the late 1990s that the box was opened again. A visitor saw the medals, read the citations, realized what had been missing. This man should have received the highest honor. The process to correct the record took years. Appeals, rejections, testimony, witnesses who had watched him lie in that ditch while the world exploded around him. Generals and historians added their voices. Still, nothing moved. Conner died in 1998. He never held the medal. 2 decades later, the order was finally acknowledged. The words were read aloud in a quiet room. His widow accepted the medal on his behalf. The citation described gallantry, intrepidity, sacrifice. It did not describe the silence. It did not describe the weight of making a decision knowing you might not survive it, knowing you would never talk about it, knowing that if it worked, no one would ever truly see what it cost. One man had stayed in place while 600 advanced. One order had stopped them, and everything that followed, the lives saved, the lives lost, the years of quiet that came after, traced back to that moment. Not a shout, not a charge, just a voice on a wire, choosing to hold the line.